My name is Marlene Kane. I received my first harsh dose of adulthood when my parents died and the state placed me in foster care. I was simply thrown into a den of lions, consisting of people who were, to put it mildly, difficult. Some were outright cruel, others were crazy, and some simply did not care about anyone but themselves. In general, it was not easy, but I survived. And then I turned 18, and the family I lived with decided that their duty was done and threw me out onto the street. This happened shortly after I graduated from school. I urgently needed money, and I got a job in a bakery. In 1967, the minimum wage was only $40 an hour. I started my shift at 4 in the morning and washed the huge steel trays the bakers used, finishing by 10 or 11 in the morning. But the work didn't stop there. I then spent the rest of the day cleaning equipment, scrubbing floors, filling barrels with sugar and flour, and washing hundreds of cake and bread tins. Most days I finished around 6 p.m. It was hard, tedious work, and often it felt like my hands were simply petrified from constant contact with water and detergents. But it was money, which meant a chance for survival. Fortunately, nature had endowed me with an impressive physique 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing about 300 pounds in those days. This, of course, helped me withstand the load and prevented me from giving up when my arms literally wouldn't obey me from fatigue. Shift after shift, I continued to work, not expecting any special surprises from life. But one such surprise did appear: one of the bakery saleswomen named Crystal. Crystal was about my age and perhaps naive in her own way. She was not particularly sharp, but she was cheerful and unpretentious, exactly what was needed to take her mind off the drab everyday life. She loved food and laughed at my crude jokes, which I admit was quite attractive to me. She enjoyed gluttony, and, as it turned out, she also enjoyed spending time with me. Crystal and I quickly became close, and it all started with donuts and pizza that the bakers would make for themselves. After 2 weeks of eating all these sweets and baked goods that seemed to be in abundance, I could no longer look at them, but Crystal still enjoyed every bite. Her love of life and simplicity were something fresh for me. Crystal had a car, which was convenient for both of us. She drove me to my trailer where we could have some privacy. After some time, an affair began between us. Crystal, I later learned, came from a family where there were strict rules, and her father seemed to hold everyone under an iron fist. When she became pregnant, her father wanted to find me and teach me a lesson. Given my experience in foster care, I knew better than to mess with these people, and I needed to make a decision quickly. I enlisted in the Air Force and soon found myself far from home in a hot, muggy Vietnamese village, where I spent several months trying to forget everything I had left behind. But it turns out that problems left behind can haunt us, even when we think we have successfully escaped them. What Crystal never knew was that I once met her mother, Julie. It was a meeting that could be called strange, but as it turned out, it played a significant role in my life. Julie was a woman in her early 40s, with an expressive appearance and a figure that, despite her years, retained grace. We met when Julie asked me to help her lay tiles in her kitchen. She picked me up while Crystal and her dad were at work and took me to her house. There was already a mountain of boxes of tiles on the floor, and Julie looked a little confused as she looked at the work ahead. First, we started reading the instructions on the boxes. I wanted to understand how best to organize everything so that the tiles would lie evenly and symmetrically. Julie seemed more interested in just chatting. She constantly tried to start a conversation on a variety of topics, talking about her life, the lack of attention from her husband, and her loneliness. There was some bitterness in her words, but she tried to hide it behind a smile and jokes. I concentrated on the calculations, but her presence was beginning to confuse me. The room was getting hotter, and not just because of the hard work. Julie, sitting next to me, came closer and closer to me, as if she was looking for protection or just company. Her directness confused me a little, but I tried to act calmly, because we were nothing more than two adults who found themselves in the same room together, trying to finish work. "Do you mind if I ask something awkward?" Julie suddenly said, breaking the silence. "It depends," I smiled, trying to hide my slight excitement. She looked at me seriously, as if she were weighing her words before saying them out loud. "Am I too fat?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Depends on what you're asking," I answered evasively. "You understand, I'm too fat for men to pay attention to me," Julie added, her eyes awaiting an honest answer. I decided not to ignore her question and said sincerely, "Appearance is a matter of preference. Everyone sees beauty in their own way. For many men, including me, you are very attractive." Julie smiled slightly, but her gaze remained worried. It seemed that it was important for her to hear not just words of consolation, but to find true understanding and sincerity in them. This conversation revealed her more to me. I realized that Julie wanted not just help with repairs, but also basic participation, understanding, and human warmth. We continued laying tiles, discussing everything under the sun: life, relationships, expectations. Julie turned out to be a much deeper person than I could have imagined at first glance. She talked about her family, about how difficult it is sometimes to feel needed and important in this world. I listened to her, trying not only to keep the conversation going, but to really understand her feelings. Finally, she broke the pause that hung in the room. "So, if you were my age, would you find me attractive?" Her question was filled with some touching insistence. "I still find you attractive," I replied, without losing my seriousness. "The only reason I wouldn't date mature women is my age. Most older women just don't get involved with younger guys. Unless they are teachers," I added, trying to diffuse the situation a little. Julie laughed, but then there was a short, awkward silence. I went back to work, feeling her gaze on me. I raised my head and met her gaze direct, studying, without a drop of embarrassment. "Okay, enough of that," she said with a smile, throwing the instruction sheet onto the floor. "Would you like a beer?" "Of course," I answered, trying not to show surprise. "And don't say a word to my husband." She smiled with a wink. She returned with 2 bottles, handed me one, and sat down next to me. She looked relaxed, but there was still that same uncertainty in her eyes. "Do you think young guys might find me desirable?" she asked, studying my reaction. I decided to take a risk, realizing that the moment required sincerity. "Personally, I think you're an amazing woman," I said, feeling my pulse quicken slightly. "I—" She sang softly, her voice trembling. "Yes, Julie, you are beautiful and attractive," I confirmed. She smiled, and a small smile appeared on her face, as if something heavy had moved from its place inside her. "Let's go, get up." "Enough of this nonsense," she said, suddenly changing her tone to a more cheerful one. Julie and I sat on her bed, next to each other. The room was comfortably lit by the soft light of a table lamp, creating an atmosphere of trust and comfort. We laughed, talked relaxedly, and she continued to ask me questions about sex, which deepened our conversation more and more. "Do you like older women?" she asked, raising one eyebrow with a slight smile. "This often happens to young guys, right?" I nodded, smiling back. "Certainly. I think every young guy at least once in his life dreams of being in the company of a hot, mature woman. This is quite natural." She grinned, took a drag from her cigarette, her eyes narrowed slightly, and she asked, peering at me, "What about you? Do you want to get naked with a hot, mature woman?" I felt myself blush, but my honesty outweighed my embarrassment. "Of course I want to." Her lips curled into a smile, and she took another drag, then blew out a cloud of smoke. "So what are we waiting for?" she said, looking me straight in the eyes. In her gaze, I saw an unexpected seriousness that made my heart beat faster. She continued, but this time her voice was quieter, as if she was trying to understand my feelings, to penetrate deeper into my thoughts. "Have you ever fantasized about me?" She narrowed her eyes, clearly reading my reaction. I hesitated, but I understood that there was no point in pretending between us anymore. "Yes, I admit, I think about you. You are very sexy, and I often find myself comparing you to other girls and women." Julie took my hand, her touch soft and confident. She met my gaze and, approaching, whispered, "If you want to compare, let me give you something to compare." I looked into her eyes, trying to read her intentions. So if I just attacked you right now, you wouldn't call for help, and you wouldn't say anything to Crystal." Julie grinned, her voice filled with challenge. "Why don't you try it, and we'll see." And while I won't go into detail about what happened next, all I can say is that we were closer than ever. It was so intense that time seemed to stand still, and we completely forgot about everything around us. After the passions had subsided, Julie turned to me with a playful smile on her lips. "Now, I think a bath is just right. I wouldn't want you to go home smelling like me," she said with a slight mockery. "Besides, I'll help you wash up." We got up and headed to the bathroom. She filled the large bathtub with hot water, adding aromatic oils that quickly filled the room with a subtle and soothing aroma. The water was relaxing, and I sank into it, listening to Julie talk about how she and Crystal came home one day and found me sleeping on the couch. "Then I had some very bold thoughts," she admitted, smiling shyly, her eyes sparkling. "Baby, I want you to stay with me a little longer after I do everything to please you." Her words sounded very sincere, and at that moment I felt like the boundaries between us were becoming thinner. She helped me clean up, drying me gently with a towel, as if caring for me in a way no one had ever cared for me before. Then she directed me to the door, saying goodbye with a tender kiss. "I meant what I said. Now I belong to you, and you can use it whenever you want," she added, and her words stayed with me, warming me from the inside. We saw each other often after that. Our meetings were filled with mystery and a sense of danger that made every minute special. But one day, everything became too difficult. I felt that the situation was starting to get out of control and decided that it would be better to leave the city before trouble overtook both of us. Perhaps Crystal's father was beginning to suspect something, and I didn't want to face the consequences of his anger. My service in the army was quite calm, until one day a situation arose with one of my colleagues, which turned out to be much more complicated than I could have expected. It all started with the fact that he couldn't stand being called by a certain nickname. At that moment, it seemed to me that this was a common misunderstanding, but the tension gradually grew and one day grew into a real conflict. The situation escalated, and one night he came to me with a knife. It was then that I realized that things had gone too far, and it was obvious that the situation had become critical. An incident occurred that led to the end of the conflict, but left its mark. We both remained silent about what happened, and none of our colleagues witnessed what happened. There was no evidence, only rumors and guesses. Me and another colleague were called in for questioning and tested with a lie detector, but nothing could be proven. After that, we were transferred to different units, which helped to avoid further clashes, but the feeling of anxiety and understatement remained with me. Almost a year later, I was sent to Vietnam to the Phat Tuat base. There we received intensive training in perimeter security and the use of weapons to defend against possible attacks. The situation was difficult. The hot climate, lack of resources, and the constant threat of attacks created a difficult atmosphere. We were taught how to quickly respond to emerging threats and how to act under constant stress. It seemed that life here depended on instant decisions and the right actions at any given moment. A few weeks after my arrival at the base, the first attack occurred. It was in the evening when the sun was almost disappearing behind the horizon. Suddenly, the shelling began, and it became clear that the enemy was trying to break through the barriers. I was ordered to take a position and shoot at anything that tried to cross the perimeter. I set up a concrete drain under the road, using sandbags for cover. It was hot, and the feeling of anxiety only intensified from constant anticipation. There was only one thought in my head. I must protect the base, my team, and myself. After some time, I heard a helicopter approaching. It was a new Cobra attack helicopter equipped with missiles and a Gatling machine gun. The pilot turned on the spotlight, and everything around was lit up as if it were day. In its light, I saw two enemy soldiers who were trying to hide in the darkness. At that moment, my heart began to pound faster, and I knew I had to act quickly. I took aim and pulled the trigger. One of them fell, and the second tried to run away. The helicopter chased after him, continuing to illuminate the area, and I knew that my target was hit. Soon a jeep containing a master sergeant drove up to my position. He came out, looked around, then came up to me and took my M16. "How many shots did you fire?" he asked. "One," I answered. The sergeant, without saying a word, added 2 more shots from my weapon. Then he said, "Didn't they tell you that you have to fire 3 shots when you kill an enemy?" It turned out that the Air Force had a policy requiring all sentries to first shout a verbal warning and fire 2 warning shots before shooting to kill. But in practice, everything was completely different. We killed with the first shot and fired warnings and warning shots after. This order was invented by someone at headquarters who had never been on the front line. That incident made me think about how important it is to hide the facts in a stream of unnecessary information that no one can verify. The headquarters received their 3 cartridges without having the slightest idea which one was fired first and which one was fired last. I remained above suspicion, and my task was completed. After this, the service continued as usual. From time to time, there were ground attacks on the base, and on the darkest nights, we were bombarded with mortars. Life in constant tension became commonplace, and despite the fact that what was happening around me was dangerous and sometimes terrible, I learned to accept it as part of the service, as an inevitable reality of wartime. My comrades and I stuck together, supported each other, and understood that it was our duty to protect the base and each other, no matter what. During our time in the Air Force and Army, we were often exposed to life off base, which the locals called Dodge City. It was a dirt road lined with bars and clubs where you could meet girls earning their living. Each day seemed similar to the previous one, with the Air Force visiting the sites during the day and the Army occupying them at night. But the officers, in turn, spent time with Red Cross nurses on the base. Those who looked after our barracks also offered their services. This whole system was part of the harsh reality that I had to accept. My first experience with local culture occurred literally on the second day of my stay at the base. When I went into the toilet to simply perform a normal physiological need, I was amazed by what I saw. The toilet was full of women washing clothes. They calmly and without any embarrassment went about their business, not even paying attention to our presence. It was unusual and strange, but I soon realized that for them our nakedness was a completely common occurrence that did not evoke emotions. When I returned home after a long service, it seemed like a return to a peaceful and comfortable world. I spent several days just enjoying the tranquility and the beautiful people around me. Immediately after returning, I was sent to Europe, where I spent the next 2 years working and experiencing a completely new world. I visited a lot of bars, met different people, and felt like this was a real eye-opening time for me. I met girls from different parts of the world and gained new impressions and experiences. When my tour of duty ended, I returned home to my hometown of Salt Springs and attended local college. Getting a job was not so easy, but I decided not to be satisfied with the minimum wage and start my own business. First, I posted business cards all over town. Then I bought an old Chevrolet pickup truck and started working as a laborer. Clients appeared almost immediately, and soon my work brought me enough money to support myself. One day, I received an order from a woman named Velma. She was a woman of character, and we soon met again in college. Velma clearly gravitated towards younger men. This became obvious when I happened to catch her in the library, where she was hanging out with a guy named Lonnie. Since then, our communication has become much more personal. She called me, and I invited her to my trailer. We spent the evening discussing life and reminiscing about our past encounters. Despite her appearance, Velma was an open-minded person with a lot of life experience, and this made her attractive in her own way. The next day, Velma came back to say that someone had slashed a tire on my truck. Perhaps this was a sign that our connection was more noticeable to others than I thought. However, we continued to communicate and support each other in difficult moments. During this time, I met a teacher named Laverna Zebar, who taught a course on Gothic horror. Unfortunately, the course was not the most engaging, and I suspected that Laverna did not fully understand the subject. However, I continued to attend her classes and tried to get something useful out of the course. At that time, I was in my early 20s and in excellent physical shape. I boxed and kept myself in shape, not trying to become a champion, but knowing my limits. During those years, I realized that life is not always about fighting for recognition, but sometimes just about being yourself, seeing the world as it is, and doing what brings you pleasure. I needed to work to make ends meet. The Veterans Benefits Act, known as the GI Bill, covered my college costs and was my only opportunity to obtain an education. My car, an old 1964 Ford Mustang, was perhaps the most valuable thing I owned. Under the hood of this beauty was a 289 cubic inch V8, and I was proud to have a manual transmission. Despite the years, the car was in good condition and gave me a feeling of freedom, which was so necessary in those difficult times. My house was a 1947 Spartan trailer, only 8 feet wide and 30 feet long. It was a very modest home, but it served me faithfully. The trailer had a concrete block outbuilding that I used as a living room. There was something charmingly old-fashioned about the place, a small trailer park that had once been home to Canadian retirees and was now a refuge for the working poor like me. We were all united by a certain common philosophy, the desire to stay afloat, despite the circumstances. Laverne, one of my acquaintances, was quite a remarkable person. She was about 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed about 200 pounds, but her self-confidence made that weight seem completely insignificant. She carried most of her weight in her chest and hips, which gave her figure a curve that was eye-catching. Her hair was thick and brown, and she kept it short, practical, and low maintenance. Laverne was Jewish and married to a judge named Mel. Despite her social status, she did not care about external appearance. She wore simple glasses with cheap plastic frames and avoided makeup. A few weeks after classes began, she invited me to her office in the evening after class. We already communicated well, and her invitation did not seem unusual. She was sitting at her desk when I walked in and motioned to the chair opposite. The decor in the room was cozy, although a little dated. The yellowed pages of the books on the shelves, the old carpet on the floor, all this created the feeling that time passed more slowly here. Laverna began the conversation with a note of caution. "I've heard rumors that you trade written work for sex," she said, raising one eyebrow slightly. I was not surprised by her question and decided not to avoid answering. "It's true," I answered bluntly. "With whom?" she asked, her eyes carefully studying my face. "I don't give away clients," I said, noticing that her sweater was missing a button. This small defect on her clothes for some reason gave her even more charm. "I see," she smiled slightly. "They say that you are not idle. I produce results and submit work on time, and my fee won't put a dent in your wallet," I added, realizing that the conversation was becoming very personal. "What does your pay depend on?" Laverna asked, her voice calm, but with a hint of curiosity. "On the result," I answered. "If you want to get A, but B comes out, then there is no fee. But if you get an A, then I don't ask for anything that you can't give with a smile. But it must be worthy of what you received in exchange." Laverne tilted her head slightly, her gaze becoming more focused. "You mean, for example?" "For example, anything," I answered without looking away. "I leave bad clients to others." Then I took a business card out of my pocket and handed it to her. "You will get the best from me, and I want the same in return." She took the card, looked at it for a second, and then returned her eyes to me. "What is this?" she asked, smiling skeptically. "My address and phone number. If I don't answer, leave a message." I didn't expect her reaction. She suddenly looked determined. "When can we meet?" she asked, her voice sounding almost quiet. "Close the door," I replied. She stood up and closed the door, then turned on the table lamp next to the sofa, soft light filling the room. I turned off the overhead fluorescent light, and the setting became more intimate quiet, with dim lighting. The only sound in the room was the air flowing through the air conditioning vents, giving the moment an almost surreal atmosphere. As I got closer, Laverne stood up. I grabbed her lower back, and our lips met. It was a moment full of anticipation and inevitability, a moment when all barriers and moral restrictions disappeared. But suddenly, there was a soft knock on the door. Laverne pulled away, her face taking on a stern look, and she quickly buttoned up her sweater. She opened the door before the knocking stopped. Standing in the doorway was her husband, Mel, a judge. His face expressed slight surprise. "I'm a little early," he apologized, looking inside. I quickly grabbed my book bag and walked to the door to leave, trying to do it as naturally as possible. "Marlene Davis," I said, holding out my hand for Mel to shake. "Mel Zebar, her husband," he answered with a typical middle-class, amiable smile, shaking my hand. Laverne looked at me and said, "I will contact you about your proposal." "Great," I replied, noticing that her skirt was slightly unzipped at the back. I turned away and left the room, trying to hide my inner smile. On the street, I looked at my watch. The hands showed a little after 10 in the evening. The campus was already silent, and the cafeteria was closed. My stomach began to growl loudly, and I suddenly remembered the Night Owl Diner, a place I'd been to a couple of times before. Despite the late hour, I decided to go there to have dinner. Night Owl Diner was one of those classic American diners that were so popular in the mid-20th century. It resembled a double trailer nestled on a street corner. Half of the space was reserved for the kitchen, pantry, and toilets, and the other half for visitors. The whole place looked like something out of a movie, a long counter with tall stools, shiny chrome, and a few booths along the wall with red vinyl seats. The floor was covered with tiles in a checkerboard pattern. Black and white squares gave the room a special retro style. Each booth had a small jukebox into which you could drop a quarter and choose from 40 popular tunes to fill the silence with the soft sounds of classical or rock and roll. I went up to the counter and ordered roast beef, a juicy slice of meat, neatly placed on toast and generously poured with aromatic gravy. It came with mashed potatoes and green beans, a typical but cozy, comforting combo. I also ordered iced tea to quench my thirst. A few minutes later, the waitress approached me, a woman of about 40, with a kind smile and slight fatigue in her eyes. Her manner of communication was reminiscent of a typical good-natured mother, polite, but with a hint of caring, as if she was sincerely concerned that I would get my dinner and be happy. I had seen her before, but I had never started a conversation. I didn't even know her name. When she returned with my order, I decided to ask, "What time do you finish your shift?" I said, trying to make my voice casual. "At 11, she answered, placing the plate in front of me. Her eyes met mine, and she raised an eyebrow, as if guessing where the conversation was going. "Shall I give you a ride?" I suggested, trying to look as natural as possible. "Where?" She tilted her head slightly, clearly intrigued. "Home or wherever you say," I shrugged, not showing that I was worried about her answer. She smiled slightly, and a slight playfulness appeared in her gaze. "I have a boyfriend," she admitted, but without condemnation, rather with slight regret. "Does he need an elevator too?" I teased, hoping she would appreciate my humor. She shook her head and grinned. "No, but he won't like it if I bring someone home. He knows I'm dating. Is your car here?" "Aha, it's a blue Mustang," I said, nodding towards the parking lot. "I'll wait for you, or you wait for me." She nodded, and I felt a little nervous. I finished eating before she did and went outside to get some fresh air and wait for her. The night was cool, the air saturated with the scent of street lamps and asphalt after the recent rain. After a while, she appeared at the door of the diner, and I handed her $20 for dinner and perhaps for company. Without further ado, she put the money in her pocket, took out a pack of Salem cigarettes, pulled one out and lit it, looking at me through a thin stream of smoke. This night seemed strange and unpredictable, as if it was part of some movie, where every moment was imbued with the atmosphere of something special and secret. Her badge said Polina. Her uniform was a pink cotton dress with white trim, buttons running from the collar to the hem, and a neat white apron to highlight her caring appearance. On her feet were white sneakers, which added a casual practicality to the look. Polina looked like she came straight from another era. Her appearance perfectly matched the retro atmosphere of the diner. Most of the waitresses working here earned extra money by providing intimate services for $20, not including the room rate. A motel that provided such services cost another $5 to $10 per night. Almost all of them arrived in their own cars, which they left in the diner's parking lot, a routine part of their difficult lives. The motel room cost me $9. It was a small, modest room with a double bed, covered with 2 pillows and double sheets. On the bed was a Chennel bedspread with a simple pattern. The room was dimly lit by an old-fashioned lamp that was barely doing its job. I went to the window and closed the curtains, cutting off the remaining light from the street, which seemed empty and silent. Polina went into the bathroom, turning on the light and closing the door behind her. Through the thin walls, I heard her sit down on the toilet. Meanwhile, I took off my clothes and lay down on the bed, stretching out tiredly, as if trying to feel comfort in this alien and faceless room. When she left the bathroom, I heard the water flush, and then the door opened, and Polina appeared in the dim light of the lamp. She looked a little embarrassed, but her movements were confident. She was about 40 years old. Her dark curly hair was cut into a bob style, which gave her a certain elegance to her appearance. She was much shorter than me, about 5 feet 3 inches tall, and had a thick build, her figure hiding some of the weight due to the volume in her chest, arms, and hips, giving an impression of strength and stability. She walked over to the bed, slowly began to take off her clothes, and carefully hung them on the counter next to the dresser, trying not to wrinkle a single fold. Her movements were measured, almost ritualistic, as if she was trying to maintain at least a shred of dignity in this situation. Meanwhile, I stretched out on the bed, resting my head on the pillow and watching her in the semi-darkness of the room. We spent time together, remaining silent as if words were unnecessary. Hidden emotions, fatigue, and a certain sense of necessity weighed on both of us, but there was no condemnation or complaints, just another evening, another meeting in a series of the same. After that, we got dressed in complete silence. I helped her button the back of her dress, and we headed to the car. It was almost 11 outside. The night air was refreshing after the stuffy room. I started the engine and drove Polina home without saying any extra words. "Don't forget to come in," she said, opening the car door and smiling at me as if trying to remember this moment. "Do you always work the same shift?" I asked, trying to detect more than just an invitation in her words. "Aha, ask me if you come in." "Good night." Her voice sounded soft, almost warm, and she got out of the car, disappearing into the night. I looked after her before driving off again, leaving behind this old motel, the bright lights of the diner, and her warm, yet distant smile. The night seemed to continue its silent existence, and I returned back to the familiar emptiness of my life. I returned home and went to bed, but as soon as I closed my eyes, a noise echoed from the trailer next door, breaking the silence of the night. Sighing, I got out of bed and decided to find out what was going on. The noise was coming from my neighbor Jem Brown's trailer. Dijemu was a short woman with a stocky build and black hair curled in bouncy curls. Her appearance was very exotic. Many considered her a mulatto, but her features were more likely to resemble an Indian or Mexican type. I knocked on the door, and the guy Jem opened it. The very second he saw me, his face became distorted with hostility, and he began to behave aggressively. Tension arose between us, which very quickly grew into open conflict. The verbal altercation escalated, and it ended in a physical altercation. We both tried to prove our point, without giving each other a single step. Dijemu ran outside to intervene and separate us, but the situation was already so tense that she was unable to do so, and she became embroiled in what was happening. The police arrived quite quickly. They were called by one of the neighbors, apparently frightened by the noise and screams. The officers were going to take us all away to end this conflict. But fortunately for me, a neighbor named Angel intervened, who saw everything and gave a detailed account of what happened, which helped me avoid arrest. Angel was a young woman whose life was far from easy. Her husband was in prison, and she lived on government benefits with her mother. Angel had recently given birth to a baby, and her young mother, Juanita, was helping her cope with the responsibilities of caring for the baby. Juanita was not much older than her daughter. She was about 30 years old. She also had 2 children who were wards of the state. They both came here from Ohio, trying to start a new life in this trailer park. Juanita worked as a lingerie model in a small store near a trailer park. This was her opportunity to earn some money to support her family. Despite all the difficulties, both Angel and Juanita tried not to lose heart and found ways to survive in difficult conditions, supporting each other. Angel was grateful for any opportunity to help the neighbors, and her intervention this time saved me from a lot of problems. After the situation calmed down, I thanked Angel for her help. This incident was a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances you can find support, sometimes from those you least expect it from. The night fell silent again, and I finally returned home, trying to forget about what had happened and hoping that nights like this wouldn't happen again. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, I discovered that my truck would not start. I tried to start it several times, but the engine did not react at all. After a short inspection, I realized what was happening. Someone had drained all the gasoline from the tank. Damn it, I muttered through clenched teeth, clenching my fists. My gaze glanced at the nearby trailers. It could have been any of the park's inhabitants. A variety of people lived here, and it was difficult to trust everyone. But I suspected one person, my neighbor, with whom I recently had a conflict. There was nothing to lose. I took the empty can, got into my Mustang, and drove to the nearest gas station to fill up the car. Thoughts were spinning in my head about how this could have happened and what I should do about it now. When I got back, I filled the truck with gas, started it up, and finally headed to the Owl Diner to get some breakfast and some peace of mind. It was quiet inside the diner. It was early in the morning, and besides me, there were only two waiters there, a cook who was barely visible from behind the counter, and a policewoman seated behind the counter with a cup of coffee. I chose a booth behind the cop, trying not to attract attention. The waitress quickly approached me. Her name tag said Dolly. She smiled and, holding her notepad at the ready, asked, "Good morning. What will you order?" "Coffee, black, and bacon and eggs, please," I replied, trying to relax after the morning's troubles. "Of course," Dolly said, smiling, and went to fulfill the order. The policewoman sitting behind the counter suddenly turned to me, looking at me with curiosity. I felt her gaze, but tried not to show my anxiety. She said something quietly to Dolly, and the waitress glanced at me briefly over her shoulder before continuing her duties. A few minutes later, the policewoman stood up from her seat, holding a photograph in her hands, and approached me. Her face was serious, and there was wariness in her gaze. "Excuse me," she said, handing me a photograph. "Have you seen this man?" I took the photo and studied it carefully. The picture was of my neighbor, the same one I suspected of draining gas from my truck. My stomach dropped, but I tried to remain calm. "He lives next to me," I answered, returning the photo to her. "Where exactly?" she asked, taking out a notepad and preparing to write down the information. I took the business card out of my shirt pocket and handed it to her. The police officer looked at the card, reading the address, then looked back at me. "Do you mind talking to the police about this?" She continued, her voice sounding calm but insistent. "When?" I asked, trying to hide my irritation. The last thing I wanted was to contact the police after everything that happened. "Tomorrow, perhaps," she answered, watching my reaction. I nodded. "Tomorrow will do." She looked at the business card again, then looked at me and asked, "Is this phone number working?" "Call later and check," I suggested, grinning. I didn't like the way she interrogated me, as if I had done something myself. The policewoman smiled slightly and handed me her business card. The name on the card was Phillies Wexler. "How come I didn't notice you before?" she asked, her eyes carefully studying my face, as if she was trying to understand something. I shrugged, trying to look casual. "Because I always behave well," I lied, trying to hide my irritation. She narrowed her eyes, clearly not satisfied with my answer. "Do you have many clients?" she asked, her voice becoming a little softer, almost informal. "No one I can tell you about," I answered evasively. "Confidentiality." Phillies grinned and leaned a little closer. "And how do I know that you can handle it if I ask for help?" Her voice became quieter, and she slightly opened one of the buttons on her blouse, as if checking my reaction. I didn't take my eyes off her face, keeping my cool. "Free demonstration," I answered, trying not to show any hint of emotion in my voice. She smiled again and nodded. "I'll contact you," she said, straightening up and buttoning the button back. Then she turned around and walked away to the counter, leaving me in my thoughts. I looked at her business card, wondering what it all could mean. Another morning, which began so simply, suddenly turned into a series of strange events. I was trying to figure out where this was all going to lead, and whether I should even get involved with people like Phillies. In any case, it was something that was clearly out of the ordinary, and it made me feel wary. I finished breakfast, left my tip on the table, and headed to work, trying to focus on the day ahead. The road led past a trailer park that had a dubious reputation. The area was dysfunctional. The streets were infested with homeless people and hooligans, and every time I drove past, I felt a depressing atmosphere. But today, I was lucky to get home without incident. When I returned, I immediately took a shower, washing away the fatigue of the day, and shaved thoroughly so as not to lose my usual appearance before going to bed. The calm of the night was interrupted by a sudden loud crash. A bullet pierced the window in my bedroom, flying glass shards showering me like freezing rain. My heart was pounding, adrenaline rushed to my head, and I abruptly jumped out of bed, looking around the dark room. There was another noise in the neighborhood. Once again, Jem Jackson and her boyfriend caused another scandal. Dijamu screamed at him, her voice full of rage and despair, as if this was the last frontier. She called him every word that came to mind, but not a child of God. In turn, her boyfriend was clearly not shy in his methods, using force to silence her. I heard the sounds of furniture being smashed on the floor, sounds of struggle that echoed against the night. I knew that Jemu worked at the local McDonald's, but she also made money selling her body to married white men she met in the area. Her life was not easy, and apparently now it was returning to her like a boomerang. I felt a mixture of pity and irritation as I pulled on my jeans and went outside to see what was going on. When I came out, the first police car was already parked on the street, flashing blue lights that cut through the darkness of the night. I stood nearby, watching what was happening, feeling the cold wind sneaking under my jacket. The police shouted orders, and Jemu and her boyfriend continued to shout at each other, oblivious to the approaching police. A few minutes later, two more cars arrived. The police quickly entered the trailer, at which point Jemu's boyfriend tried to escape. He burst out the back door of the trailer and ran towards me, his face contorted with fear. I froze, seeing him rushing straight at me, but he suddenly tripped, fell, and was immediately pinned down by several cops. I felt relieved as I watched him being handcuffed. One of the police officers turned out to be my new friend Phillies Wexler, the first female patrol officer in our city. She acted professionally, without unnecessary emotions, quickly escorting this idiot to the car. Her determination and confidence inspired respect. She noticed me, nodded briefly, but it was clear in her eyes that this evening was far from over for her. When the situation finally calmed down a bit and the cops took the guy away, I went back inside my trailer to clean up the glass shards scattered around the bedroom. The room looked chaotic, as if someone had broken in and deliberately destroyed everything. I carefully collected all the large fragments, trying not to cut myself, but small pieces still remained. At some point, I felt a sharp pain. One of the small fragments, which I did not notice, pierced my leg. I cursed quietly and sat down on the bed to pull out the fragment, but it was the lesser of two evils, considering that the bullet could have hit me. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the window through which the cold wind was now blowing, and thinking about how my life had become involved in this dangerous whirlwind. All I wanted was a good night, but now every sound on the street made me wary and waiting for the next trouble. That night seemed to never end, and I realized that perhaps I should reconsider my plans and go somewhere away from this damn trailer park, where every morning and every night could turn into a new surprise and threat to life. But while I was here, I had to deal with it, trying to maintain my sanity and hope that the next day would bring some peace. The next morning, I went to a local diner for breakfast. Walking inside, I noticed a familiar atmosphere, noisy voices, the clink of dishes, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The diner was packed with people, the tables were occupied, and waiters were rushing back and forth, handing out orders. My eyes scanned the crowd, and I suddenly noticed Phillies. She was already sitting at one of the tables, eating and chatting with the waitress. When Phillies saw me, she waved her hand, inviting me to come over. I came closer, and she pointed to the empty seat opposite her. "Sit down," she said, smiling slightly. "Thanks for your help last night." This was important. I sat down opposite her, nodding. "No problem," I answered, trying not to show my surprise. Phillies looked more relaxed than the day before. She was dressed in a simple blue shirt and jeans, her hair neatly pulled back into a ponytail. It seemed that the morning brought her the calm that she had so lacked at night. As soon as I got comfortable, a man walked past us. He looked slightly flustered, his gaze quickly moving to Phillies, and he dropped a plain white envelope on the table in front of her. I saw Phillies' eyes narrow slightly, but she didn't say anything. Calmly taking the envelope, she put it in her bag, pretending that nothing special had happened. I tried to catch her gaze, but she quickly changed the topic. "Maybe I can find something at home that you can fix." "Interesting," she said, her voice sounding feignedly innocent, as if she was trying to hide something. I shrugged, trying not to show my curiosity. "Uh-huh," I answered briefly, but my head was full of questions about what had just happened. Phillies looked at me carefully, as if she was trying to read my thoughts, and, smiling, added, "Call me if you're free by noon." She took a napkin from the table, wrote a phone number on it, and slipped it into my pocket, her fingers lingering on the fabric of my shirt for a moment before she leaned back and stood up again. "Good luck to you," she said, nodding and heading towards the exit. Her confident walk seemed to emphasize that everything was under control, even if it seemed otherwise. I remained at the table, a little confused, thinking about her words and the envelope she accepted. Another strange meeting with Phillies. It seemed like every time I ran into her, things got more confusing. After breakfast, I went to see my client who needed help. A lot of dirt had accumulated in his soul, the drain was clogged, and the water was no longer draining. The customer seemed worried and apologized several times for the mess, but I assured him that this was normal for me. I inspected the pipes and realized that I would have to unscrew one of them to clear the blockage. The smell, to put it mildly, was not pleasant, but work is work. I took the tool, unscrewed the pipe, and began cleaning. Dirty water splashed onto my boots, and I felt my patience begin to wear thin. But having gathered myself, I finished the job, cleaned the pipe, and made sure that the water was flowing freely again. The client was immensely grateful. His face relaxed when the problem was solved. He offered me a cup of coffee, but I politely declined, saying that I had other things to do. I said goodbye to him and, leaving the house, felt a little tired, but satisfied with the work done. The day was just beginning, and I still had many tasks to solve, but thoughts of Phillies and that envelope still did not leave me. Something told me that this story would soon continue, and I was ready for whatever happened next. Phillies lived in the old house with her girlfriend Myrtle and Myrtle's 2 daughters. This was her home and, apparently, her fortress. Myrtle, a retired military man who was studying to become a school psychologist, had the appearance of someone accustomed to discipline and order. Seeing her for the first time, I realized that this is not the kind of person you should joke with. However, the idea of sleeping with Phillies seemed tempting until Myrtle unexpectedly returned home and ruined the moment. Phillies barely had time to get out of it, saying that I was supposedly doing some kind of secret work under the guise of a plumber. Anything to avoid suspicion. But before Myrtle arrived, Phillies managed to hint to me that she needed someone like me to cover her on the street. "I have problems with some people, maybe you can help?" She looked me straight in the eyes. In her gaze, there was a certain mixture of danger and request. I thought for a moment and then asked, "Why do I need this?" I tried to sound indifferent, but it was interesting how far she was willing to go. Phillies moved closer, put her hand on my shoulder, and said quietly, "I will be very grateful. I can do you some favors in return. I think we could work well together." Her voice became lower, almost a whisper, and her eyes sparkled in the dim light. I wrapped my arm around her waist and pulled her towards me, and she kissed me back sharp and passionate. This kiss promised a lot. "Who needs to be removed?" I joked, but deep down I felt that there was nothing funny about it. Phillies answered without leaving my lips. "You'll recognize the name at the first meeting," and there was not a hint of joke in her voice. At that moment, the door slammed shut and Myrtle walked into the room, breaking up our moment. Phillies quickly pulled away and said with a smile, "See you tomorrow at the same time." "I'll expect you around noon," I said, nodding, after which I said goodbye to Myrtle with a few polite words and left. The next day, Phillies told me the details of what she needed to do, and I solved her problem. It wasn't the cleanest job, but I knew that doing things like this could have its benefits in the future. Most of my clients were women. One of them, Lucy Perez, called me asking me to fix a leaky kitchen faucet. I went to her house, and she showed me the problem. The kitchen was cozy, with lots of green plants on the windowsill and photographs of the family on the walls. While I was fiddling around under the sink, I heard Lucy talking on the phone to her friend. "He hasn't touched me for months. I'm already climbing the walls with desire." Her voice sounded with a hint of irritation and despair, and I involuntarily caught this moment. Lucy was an attractive woman in her 40s. She had a rounded shape, the extra weight on her hips, waist, and buttocks gave her a feminine appearance. I tried to concentrate on my work and not pay attention to her conversation. When I was done, I walked out from under the sink and headed towards the living room to call her over to make sure everything was ready. But when I entered, I found her in a chair with her robe unbuttoned. She flinched when she saw me and quickly reached to button her robe. "Damn, you could have warned me before you entered the room, otherwise you scared the crap out of me," she said with slight embarrassment, trying to hide her laughter, her face flushed. "What do you need?" "I'm done with the tap. Want to check?" I asked calmly, pretending that nothing had happened. She looked at me with narrowed eyes, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're pretty confident, huh? How much do I owe you?" $100, I answered, trying to keep my tone even. Lucy sighed and, without taking her eyes off me, asked, "Can I give the money later when my husband returns home?" "No problem. Do you have my address?" I handed her a business card. "It's on the card." She looked at it and, without taking her eyes off the card, said, "Will it be around 7? "Certainly." "What are you drinking?" I asked, smiling slightly. She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my question. "For what?" "To offer you something," I answered calmly, as if it were a very ordinary conversation. "Yes, you are confident to the point of impudence." She chuckled, but her tone was more playful than indignant. "I won't be long," I added, nodding goodbye. "I have bourbon and vodka, or would you like something else?" she asked, already softening a little. "Can you find tomato juice?" I answered, grinning. "I'll go to the store," she said, continuing to smile. "You won't tell anyone?" Her voice became more serious. She looked carefully into my eyes. "Do you want him to say—" I raised an eyebrow, teasing her. "Hell no," she chuckled, shaking her head. "Then everything is fine. I have one more challenge." "See you at 7, I said, heading towards the door. Lucy arrived around 8. She was dressed in a simple cotton button-up dress, her dark hair was neatly styled, and she had a small flower pinned behind her ear. She knocked on the door, and I opened it for her. She came in, leaving her bag on the kitchen table, pulled out a receipt, and handed it to me. Then she took a pack of cigarettes out of her bag and asked, "Do you mind if I smoke? I won't be long." "I don't care. Will you have time to drink?" I asked, grinning. "Better not. He thinks I'm in the library." Her eyes met mine, and a light appeared in them. "Do you want to undress me, or—" She didn't have time to finish as I began to unbutton the top button of her dress, then the next one, moving down. "Lock the door?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling, but confident. I locked the front door and led her into the bedroom. The trailer was old, but the bed and mattress were new, which gave the room some comfort. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes following my movements. I need to go to the bathroom, she exclaimed, suddenly jumping up and running out of the room. Returning a few minutes later, she asked, a little embarrassed, "Do you have protection?" I grinned, patting the nightstand. "The gun is in the box." She rolled her eyes, but there was a certain tenderness in her smile. "Damn, I can still get pregnant. Can I take a bath later?" "Of course," I answered, looking into her eyes, and we made love. After some time, Lucy quickly got dressed, buttoning up her dress, and headed to the bathroom, but soon returned with an apologetic look. "I don't have time for a bath." She dried herself with toilet paper and got dressed. In parting, she came up to me, pressed her lips to mine, kissing me lightly. "Can I come again?" "I don't know when." Her voice was a little sad. "Just let me know in advance," I replied with a shrug. "Do you have a wife?" She looked at me carefully, as if trying to guess the answer. "No," I answered. "Young woman?" "Not either." "Buy condoms then," she said, a slight grin in her voice before she headed out. I walked her to the door, and she got into her car and then drove away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I exhaled, took a shower, got dressed, and decided to go to the Owl Bar to relax a little and forget after all these events. One evening, an unexpected surprise awaited me at home. As I pulled up to my trailer, I noticed there was a car parked outside the house. Crystal was sitting behind the wheel. Her silhouette was easily recognizable, even in the twilight. She was in her friend Sherry's car and seemed nervous, her fingers tapping on the steering wheel and her eyes darting from the window to the front door. As I approached the door, Crystal stepped out of the car, her steps quick and decisive. I opened the door for her as if we were still a couple, although a lot had changed between us. "I won't be long," she said, her voice a little tense. "Sherry will pick me up at 10. I nodded and let her inside, watching as she took off her jacket and tossed it over the back of her chair. The kitchen clock said 8:30. Sherry, her friend and co-worker from the car wash, waited in the car while Crystal went into the bathroom, leaving the door ajar. I headed to the bedroom, trying to figure out why she came. We had not communicated for a long time, and her unexpected visit seemed mysterious to me. Crystal came out of the bathroom, her face thoughtful. She looked at me and suddenly said, "You have to be crazy to come here." There was a mixture of irony and regret in her voice. "Mom asked about you." "Call her," she added, standing in the doorway and crossing her arms over her chest. I frowned. "What does she need?" "Let him take my number," I answered, not understanding why she brought up this topic. Crystal sighed, rolling her eyes slightly as if I hadn't understood something important. "I was going to share a secret with you, but now I don't want to." Her voice became colder, and she turned away as if she wanted to leave. "You're pregnant," I suggested, trying to guess her secret. She froze and turned around. Her face became serious, and her eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "Where did you get the idea?" She frowned, her eyes looking at me intently, as if trying to read my thoughts. I smiled and calmly answered, "You look pregnant." Her face changed slightly, the tension disappeared, giving way to a slight smile. "No, I'm not pregnant," she said, taking a step towards me. "But I want another child from you." Her words were spoken quietly, but there was something very personal, almost intimate in them. She smiled and turned to the window, waving to her friend sitting in the car. "Sherry, do you want to join?" Sherry opened the car door and began to slowly get out. She looked a little embarrassed, but determined. She walked to the door and looked inside, as if checking if she could enter. "Because I don't allow anyone but you to be this close to me, not even my husband," Crystal added, her voice becoming softer, and she came closer to me, her fingers lightly touching my arm. I raised an eyebrow and asked with a grin, "You sleep with everyone at the car wash." Her eyes flashed with anger, and she answered sharply, "You are simply a champion of rudeness." She hissed, her face turning red with anger. She took a step back, as if trying to keep her distance. After a few moments, her face softened, and she sighed slightly, lowering her eyes. "I don't know why I'm even contacting you," she said, calming down a little. "And now I want you to win my love again." Her words were filled with longing and a certain vulnerability that she usually did not show. She turned to Sherry, who stood at the entrance, looking at us hesitantly. "Well, what are you waiting for, Sherry?" Crystal asked. Her voice became confident again, even a little defiant. Sherry sighed and answered quietly, "I want you when he's done." Her voice was almost a whisper, and she smiled nervously. When it was over, the atmosphere in the room was tense, but at the same time seemed freed from pent-up emotions. Sherry sat on the sofa, her face expressing complete relaxation. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed lost in her thoughts. I looked at my watch and realized that time had come to an end. I stood up, helped Crystal and Sherry get ready, and we all headed outside. I got behind the wheel of Sherry's car and drove them both home. Crystal was silent the whole way. Her eyes were fixed on the window, and she seemed thoughtful. Sherry smiled, her mood was lighter, and she quietly hummed something under her breath. When we arrived, Crystal looked at me, her eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw something deep in them, maybe regret, maybe gratitude. She nodded slightly and got out of the car with Sherry, heading towards her house. 2 blocks from Martin Luther King Avenue, I turned into a narrow alley that led to a parking lot behind an old warehouse that was now used as a commercial distribution center. The busy avenue was behind me, and I found myself in the shadow of old wooden duplexes built a century ago for cigar factory workers. Now this area was called slums, and there was an atmosphere of abandonment and disorder, peeling walls of houses, cracked windows, and gray roads. The alley ran along railroad tracks that were once used for loading and unloading freight cars near the warehouses. Now the rails were rusty and weeds were pushing through the gravel, a reminder of a time long gone. I parked the car at the edge of the road, got out, and walked towards the back door of the warehouse, which was slightly open. Trying to close it, I heard the grinding of rusty hinges. The hinges were glued together by rust, and the door no longer gave in. The inside of the warehouse was semi-dark, except for the faint light that filtered through the translucent corrugated glass on the roof, painting the space in dull shades of gray. My footsteps echoed through the empty room, and I crossed the warehouse, heading towards the office at the far end of the building. My heart was beating slightly faster, but I tried to remain calm. When I opened the office door, my attention was immediately drawn to the scene in front of me. The man I was looking for was having sex with a girl. The room was stuffy, and for a moment I froze, but then quickly came to my senses. My job was simple but cold. I did what I had to do. I killed him and left. I later learned that Phillies, with whom I had a special relationship, knew everything about this assignment. She was in her mid-40s, Italian, 5 feet 7 inches tall, with long blonde hair that framed her face. She was slender, weighed about 150 pounds, and had a figure to admire. That day, I decided to visit her. I went to her house and knocked on the kitchen door. A few seconds later, the door opened and Phillies appeared on the threshold. Her face lit up with a smile when she saw me. "Come in," she said, stepping aside and letting me inside. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "Wait a little, I'll just grab my purse. You need money, right?" She went into another room, and I heard her rummaging through some drawers. Soon Phillies returned, her face thoughtful and her purse in her hands. "I have money," she said, opening her purse and rummaging through it, as if checking that everything was in place. I looked at her and said quietly, "Let's have better sex. Keep the money for yourself." Phillies looked up. Her gaze was serious, but a slight smile appeared at the corners of her lips. "Do you think I'm worth it?" she asked, her voice sounding slightly mocking, as if she didn't believe I was serious. "Of course," I answered without hesitation, looking her straight in the eyes. She paused for a moment, studying me, then smiled. "You're a sweet boy," she said, her voice becoming softer and containing a hint of tenderness. "Aren't you coming back for the money later?" "It depends," I shrugged, trying not to reveal my true emotions. Phillies nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. "But I want to make sure." She paused and then added, "Shall we go to the bedroom?" I knew Phillies knew how the job went. She was a cop, and I later found out why she was so desperate for this man to be dead. But at that moment, I didn't ask questions. I just followed her into the bedroom. Phillies took off her robe, her movements smooth and confident. She climbed onto the bed, her eyes met mine, and desire was visible in them. She crawled towards me on her knees, her hands gently touching my shoulders. We made eye contact, and I felt her desire. I turned my head and kissed her. Her lips were warm, and at that moment everything else ceased to exist. "I'm pleased that I excite you," she whispered, pulling away slightly, her eyes shining. "I wish my husband would react to me like that." This was the first time I heard about her husband. She mentioned him as if he were something long forgotten. "What's his name?" I asked, touching her neck. "Sal," she answered. "He prefers to drink and watch TV." Her voice sounded sad. They were separated, and there was disappointment in her words. "His loss," I said, hugging her and holding her close. Phyllis smiled, her eyes met mine, and she answered quietly, "You're just saying that." We reached out to each other again and kissed, and in that kiss there was everything: passion, desire, emotions that we hid from everyone else. I felt her warmth, her touch, and something indescribable grew between us. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered, her voice soft, as if she was afraid to disturb the moment. "About how I want to be next to you," I answered, looking into her eyes. She moaned softly, her lips slid over mine, and we continued our gentle touches, experiencing unquenchable passion. "You're driving me crazy," she whispered, a smile touching her lips and her eyes shining with desire. After that, we lay together, enjoying each other's warmth. Her touch left a feeling of peace and contentment on my body, and I felt that there was something more between us than just physical intimacy. "I liked you more than I expected," she admitted with a slight smile running through my hair. Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. I looked at her and asked, "See you again?" Phyllis smiled, her eyes met mine, and she answered quietly, "Of course, if you try just as hard." Her voice sounded playful, and she grinned. After that, we saw each other often. She came to my trailer more and more often when I was home. We didn't need words when we were together. There was an invisible connection between us that grew every time we met. Around the height of the election campaign, she suddenly asked, "Do you want to earn some money? There's one presidential candidate to keep an eye on when he's in town." "Of course," I answered. 1972 was an election year, and protesters were as common as long hair and a free spirit. George Wallace ran for president. Phillies got me a job watching him when he came to town. I spent the evening in my Mustang outside his motel room. Around 10 in the evening, some guys in bell-bottoms came up to my car and started teasing it. Wallace was unpopular among hippies. I got out of the car to deal with them, but they ran away. My shift ended at midnight, and I left. Along the way, I ran into these same guys again in the drive-in parking lot. I usually don't get into conflicts just like that, but the situation has escalated. I parked my car behind the building and walked up to their car, an old wrecked Simca Aron from 1959 or so. A tense situation arose in which I made it clear that they had crossed the line. After that, I returned to my place, but everything turned out worse than I thought. This guy turned out to be no ordinary person. His mother was a U.S. Senator named Claire Nelson. The police quickly found me in my trailer, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The police did not hide their attitude towards me. They were furious about what happened to the senator's son. I had to face serious consequences, but I knew that the situation had become much more complex than a typical parking lot confrontation. It ended up being tense, but I was stronger than they expected, and that kept them from taking more decisive action. My murder trial took the entire morning, with Todd's mom using most of the time to cry and scream at me. But I didn't sit quietly. They tied me up so that I wouldn't give her the middle finger while she was putting on her show. I'm not one of those who thinks everything through in advance. I act, and if I screw up, I accept what they give me. Logic is for cowards. The jury reflected on their petty problems and affairs at home, and I was sentenced. Back then, the state put new prisoners in a cage on a bus and sent them to a reception center, where we spent a week filling out paperwork, going through interviews and various tests and evaluations for assignments. It reminded me of my first week of basic training in the Air Force. We were told nothing but lies so that we would behave quietly. They didn't need problems. There were 15 people in our party, and no one received anything other than formal statements from officials to speed up the process and for the good. Most of us were repeat offenders. I was the only one in the group convicted of murder. The Lake Butler Welcome Center was a cold brick and concrete building, lit by fluorescent lights and filled with wooden benches. They stripped us, weighed us, measured us, cut our hair, and took our things away. We sat at attention for hours while the guards shouted at us and threatened us. At midnight, we were sent to solitary confinement, and the next morning at 4 o'clock, everything started all over again, but in the company of new prisoners who had arrived from other county jails. Some were forced to wash the floors, others were forced to stand at attention with their noses pressed to the wall, otherwise they would be beaten. Screams were common. Sometimes someone was taken away. It was a different world, where the guards shouted, spat, cursed, called you names, and insulted you for any reason. They forbade us to speak, look at them, or show any disobedience. I spent the second night in a shitty room with 5 others. I was exhausted. The prison inspection at Lake Butler was a real ordeal. F-dorm was a place where people with different personal tragedies and difficulties gathered, each with their own history and their own suffering. Here one could see many unusual destinies. There were people in wheelchairs, suffering from various diseases, people who were facing complex operations, as well as those who were waiting for medical help. The block also contained prisoners with physical limitations and chronic illnesses, which created additional difficulties for them in these difficult conditions. I spent about 10 days in this block and tried to find ways to keep myself busy. Sometimes I helped an elderly man who was in a wheelchair, taking him to lunch and filling his tray with food. We ate in silence, trying to finish as quickly as possible so as not to be rushed by the guards. The man had spent 16 years of his very long sentence in prison, and diabetes had destroyed his health to the point that his legs could no longer support him. He was waiting to be transferred to a specialized hospital where he could receive the necessary medical care. I tried to avoid communal showers where all the prisoners showered at the same time, preferring to wait until it was all over and use the shower at a quieter time. When everyone had left, I quickly and calmly washed myself under the bright lamps, trying not to attract too much attention. These were moments when one could feel at least some privacy in conditions where it almost did not exist. Every afternoon, during the count, I sat on my bunk, feeling the gaze of the guards. I noticed that there were women among them, and I still did not understand why they were attracted to such work. I was a strong guy, a veteran with combat experience. I didn't have high expectations, but I wasn't afraid either. I was large enough that they didn't want to approach me with threats again. It was clear that if someone wanted to show aggression, it would require a lot of effort. The guards were dressed as if they were preparing for a serious operation. Jumpsuits, combat boots, waist belts with a lot of equipment. These people left nothing to chance. They didn't know who we were, criminals or just lawbreakers, and they took us as seriously as possible. After the personal search, we continued processing into prison. Sometimes during this process, a group of guards would appear to take one of us away. They approached the cell, called the name, and strictly instructed, "Put your hands behind your back, go to the door." Then the prisoner was taken away. We were given a bunch of papers to fill out. I haven't dealt with this kind of paperwork since my basic training days. The first thing you had to fill out was your wishes for what to do with your body if you died in prison. Then everyone talked to a consultant who decided where exactly you would serve your sentence. For me, it was simple: life imprisonment without parole. The state prison system was divided into 4 levels. The first level were camps for minor offenders, where people were kept with short sentences. The second level was the farms around the prison complex, a place for those who were well-connected. The third level is work in production, in the canteen, and other activities for prisoners with longer sentences. The fourth level was for those serving life sentences. It was called the School of Gladiators. Gladiator School did all the heavy lifting. We handled everything related to cleaning and maintaining the area, from roof work to replacing sewer pipes. Prison is like any place where people are forced to interact and somehow get along with each other, despite all the difficulties. The Welcome Center was not as intensive as my basic training in the Air Force. At the Air Force, we were greeted by two loud instructors at the airport. The prison guards were not as neat as the military, but they seemed tougher. Their task was to put your thoughts in order and make the prisoners docile. Prison is not what they show on Scared to Death. Most prisoners don't like conflict. Problematic people create difficulties for everyone. Once a prisoner has a permanent cellmate, a job, and certain privileges, he does not want anyone to spoil his stability. The security staff at the reception center do their best to prevent such problems. The main rule of prison: do not inform or speak badly about others. Don't use others for your own benefit, and don't put anyone in awkward situations. Stick to your side and follow the ground rules. At first, I was placed in a cell under a special regime, where I was alone. I spent 23 hours a day there, only leaving to take a shower or take a short walk. I received food in my cell, and once a week the librarian brought a cart of books. After the Supreme Court decision, I was transferred to another station, where I performed various tasks. One day, a fight broke out between two prisoners, which quickly escalated into a mass brawl. The guards tried to intervene, and one of them accidentally hit me. I was able to disarm him, but then immediately raised my hands and left the conflict. I was placed in solitary confinement for some time. In those days, solitary confinement was very strict. These were small, windowless rooms with a bed, sink, and toilet. Food was delivered twice a day, and the lights were turned on at 5 in the morning and turned off at 9 in the evening. The conditions were harsh, but it gave us time to think. Now the conditions in solitary confinement have changed. Prisoners receive more freedoms and support. But in the past, solitary confinement was like being buried alive, a time to reflect on one's actions. I would often lie on my bunk and play mental games to keep myself calm. One day, I read an old book about hypnosis. It was an interesting experience that helped me better understand how the human mind works. The month in solitary was a time for me to reconsider my thoughts and priorities. At the end of my time in solitary confinement, the warden came to see me. "Are you going to cause trouble?" he asked. "If you have to," I replied. "If something starts, I will look into it. Then it will be difficult for you here. And it will be even worse for those who start." "Yes, and I get paid for this just sitting on my ass." "Do you like boxing?" he asked. "What will happen to me for this?" I answered. This is how my career in prison boxing began. About once a month, the prison held a boxing tournament organized by the warden for employees, corrections department officials, influential people, and interested politicians. The conditions and resources for training were primitive. I made my own equipment from what was at hand, but the prizes were good, although the losers were left with nothing. It was a constant tournament. If you win a fight, you move on. The first few battles were easy. I started from the bottom and gradually worked my way up. The king of the ring was an old man named Red Chastain. He was in his early 30s and had been at the top for many years. But before meeting him, I had to hold out for a whole year. By the time this year passed, I considered myself invincible. It was like that feeling when you finish basic training. You think you can handle anyone. The fights took place in an amphitheater where prison farms usually offered their best pigs and bulls for sale. The ring stood right in the center. The fight started early. Damn it, I was full of energy and ready to kick old Red's ass. He was 36 or 37 years old, and I was only 24. When I entered the ring, the crowd cheered for me. Most of them were already drunk by the time the main battle began. I returned the greetings by waving my arms as if I were Queen Elizabeth on her way to the throne. But I knew that few of these people were familiar to me. Almost everyone was a stranger to me. Climbing into the ring, I slipped between the ropes and headed to my corner, where I sat down on the milking stool. The referee, Jack Ball, came over to shake my hand. Red was an old friend of his. They both spent many years in this prison and were clearly friends. If Red decided to break the rules a little, he figured Ball would turn a blind eye. I understood this too. When Red entered the ring and headed to his corner, the crowd greeted him with loud applause. Red was a real star. I looked at him from my corner. In a few minutes, we'll be locked in combat, each trying to knock the other out. But for now, he was in sportswear, a sweatshirt and jeans over boxer shorts. Red was an attractive man with red curls and a thick, powerful neck. He reminded me of wrestler Dusty Rhodes, only with red hair. A few years ago, when he was in his prime, such ceremonies would have seemed boring to him, but now he watched everything with interest. Young people were constantly rushing into prison boxing, jumping into the ring, shouting about their confidence and readiness to win, but the old people were always the first to fall. Young people climbed to the top, overcoming the bodies of old people, and so it continued from year to year. The young, full of strength, sooner or later became old people who were supplanted by equally ambitious newcomers. Red glanced towards the VIP box and nodded to the warden. He responded with a salute. Red then held out his hands and his team put his gloves on, carefully tightening the laces while Ball made sure everything was fair. They did the same for me. Red looked at me. Before him stood youth, a wide chest, muscles that rolled under the skin as if alive. My body was full of energy that he knew he no longer had. Red understood that youth is a fleeting strength that is gradually drawn out through sweat, pain, and time. The signal to start the battle forced us to approach each other. The equipment and chairs were removed from the corners. We touched gloves and instantly took fighting stances. I started the fight by quickly moving forward, trying to find a gap in the enemy's defense, and then retreating to try again. Left to create pressure, right to achieve the goal. I was full of energy, focused, and fast. The audience roared with approval, but Red was not impressed. He knew how to fight and had seen people like me before. Fast movements often look impressive, but do not always bring victory. I was like many young hopefuls, hot-blooded, impatient, eager to show off my dominance from the start. Red knew this fighting style very well. I continued to move, attack, and jump while he waited patiently for my energy to begin to wane. He understood that the power of youth is speed, but it has a limit. While I circled him, he remained calm, waiting for the right moment. Every move I made was full of determination. I tried to find a weakness in Red's defense, moving left and right to catch him off guard. The crowd was on my side, they supported me, but Red remained focused. He was an experienced fighter who understood the importance of patience and control. Red did not give in to my provocations. His strategy was clear. Let me burn off my energy, conserve my energy, and take advantage of when I started to slow down. He knew that youth often takes risks, relying on passion rather than on plan. My style was spectacular. Fast attacks, unexpected departures, and sharp returns. I felt like a machine built to win, and I heard the audience cheering for me. But Red knew that fighting is not only about energy and speed, but also about endurance. He remained confident and patient. For him, this was another fight where youth was tested by experience. He met people like me dozens of times. His strategy was to let me express myself and use up my energy. While I was trying to find a weak spot, he was preparing for his moment, the moment when patience and experience can make the difference. I won the first round and the crowd roared. I rained down an avalanche of blows on Red, but he did nothing. He didn't throw a single punch, just covered, blocked, dodged, and clinched to avoid punishment. He feinted, shook his head when hit, and moved without wasting any extra strength. He waited until I got tired and slowed down before deciding to counterattack. All of Red's movements were slow and methodical, and his heavy, lazily moving eyes gave the impression that he was half asleep or dazed. But he saw everything he had learned over the years in the ring. Red's eyes didn't blink or waver before the blow. He calmly assessed the distance. As he sat in his corner for a moment's rest, he sat back relaxed, legs stretched out, arms resting on the ropes, chest and stomach heaving as he gasped for air as his team fanned him with towels. With his eyes closed, he listened to the voices of the crowd. "Will you tear it up, Red?" many shouted. "He's a dumb jock, he plays with his muscles, but he can't move faster," said someone in the front row. 2-1 on Kane. He looked like Mr. Imperturbability. When the bell sounded, I came within 3/4 of the distance, ready to start the fight again, and Red let me do it. This was in line with his saving strategy. He was well-trained, well-fed, and every step he took was precise due to the extra weight he carried. His battery was fully charged. The second round was a repeat of the first. I was raging like a hurricane, and the audience was complaining why Red wasn't finishing me off. Apart from a few feints and a few weak blows, all he did was block and slow me down. I wanted to speed up the pace, and Red, being wise, refused to help me. He smiled with a kind of melancholic expressiveness on his ring-hardened face and saved his strength from wisdom, accessible only to old age. I was a brash youth who spent my energy thoughtlessly. And Red had the general tactics of the ring, wisdom born of long, grueling fights. He looked at me with calm eyes and calmly waited for my fuse to dry up. For many in the room, it seemed that Red was hopelessly inferior, and they expressed their opinion with bets of 3-1 in my favor. But there were also knowledgeable people, those few who remembered Red in his best years and made bets, considering it easy money. The third round started as usual, with my dominant attack. Half a minute passed when, filled with confidence, I opened up. Red's eyes flashed and his right hand quickly launched an attack. This was his first serious blow, a hook behind which the strength of his body could be felt. He resembled a sleepy lion suddenly rushing forward. I fell to the floor. The audience gasped, and there was shocked applause. It became clear that Red could be a dangerous opponent, despite his apparent lethargy. I tried to get up, and my team shouted for me to take the count. I got up in the ninth, and Red realized his shot was close, but not hard enough to finish the fight. The round continued until the end. Now I respected my opponent, and Red remained just as calm. By the end of the round, Red quickly sat in his corner, and I had to cross the ring. These small details may seem insignificant, but they matter. I had to expend extra energy and lose some time for rest. The next 2 rounds went in a similar vein. Red saved his strength, and I continued to attack, trying to break him. Although I managed to land a lot of punches, Red remained true to his style, despite the fans shouting, "Keep going." The 6th round was a lesson in caution for me. I made a mistake and Red's shot landed. I fell, but found the strength to get up. My youthful tenacity gradually faded by the 7th round. I understood that the battle would not be easy. Red turned out to be a much more experienced and resilient opponent than I expected. He was a master of defense, his every blow felt serious, and it seemed that powerful force was hidden in each glove. But he could no longer give his best, as in his youth. In the 7th round, I noticed that Red might have been thinking about what a strong champion I could become if I combined his wisdom with my youth. But I had no desire to become a champion. Boxing was a way for me to escape hard work. I liked the gifts and attention, but it was not the meaning of my life. Red, in turn, continued to fight, drawing on his experience. Red took advantage of every opportunity. He often resorted to clinching, creating pressure and saving energy. I, as a young fighter, often spent my energy on spectacular, but not always effective maneuvers. However, Red remained persistent and withstood all my attempts to attack him. Despite my powerful blows, Red skillfully reduced their strength with his actions. It wasn't easy to see, but his defensive prowess showed in every move. In the 9th round, several times Red managed to land punches that made me fall to the floor. Each time I got up, I still had the strength to continue. I lost some of my speed, but became more careful and focused. I continued to fight, relying on my young body, while Red relied on his experience and cunning. Red knew how to use his advantage. Every minute he relied more and more on strategy, minimizing movements, forcing me to expend energy and using my excitement against me. It was a strategy he had mastered through years of training and fighting, and although each round became more and more difficult for us, we both continued to fight, each to the best of our abilities and with a different understanding of what victory means. At the beginning of the 10th round, Red stopped my impulse with straight left punches to the face. Becoming more careful, I reacted, provoking him to strike with my left, dodged, and threw a right hook, aiming for the side of his head. The blow landed too high to be effective, but when it landed, Red felt a momentary sense of failure enter his mind. For a split second, he froze. In an instant, he saw me crouched down and moving out of his field of vision, and in the background was a white wall of spectators' faces. The next moment, he saw me again, and the same faces. It was like a short dream that left no time for falling. The spectators saw him stumble, his knees buckling, but he recovered and tucked his chin deeper into the shelter of his left shoulder. I hit Red a few times, partially stunning him, but he quickly came up with a counterplan. Feinting with his left hand, he took half a step back and threw an uppercut with the full force of his right. The blow hit me square in the face as I was ducking, and I was thrown back, landing on my head and shoulders. Red repeated this twice, and then began to methodically drive me into the ropes, throwing punches. I had no time to rest or prepare. The blows fell one after another until the audience rose to its feet, and the air was filled with loud applause. Red clearly dominated the fight. But my strength and endurance were sufficient to withstand it. I stayed on my feet. A knockout seemed inevitable, and the captain of the guard, stunned by the number of punches I missed, approached the ring to stop the fight. The gong ended the round, and I staggered back to my corner, assuring the captain that I was fine. To prove this, I did some push-ups on the mat. The captain relented. Red was leaning back in his corner, breathing heavily and frowning. If the fight had been stopped, the referee would have declared Red the winner, and the victory would have been his. But instead, I got a break. Youth will take its toll. That phrase, I think, popped into Red's head, reminding him of the night he first sent the old King of the Hill into retirement. The prince, who served him a drink after the fight and patted him on the shoulder, then said, "Youth will take its toll." The prince was right. Red was youth himself that night, and now youth was sitting in the opposite corner. It was me. Red had been fighting for half an hour and was already tired. If he had fought at the same pace as me, he would not have lasted 15 minutes. But the thing was that he couldn't recover that quickly. Age did not allow him to quickly regain strength between rounds. His legs bent heavily, his muscles spasmed, and it was not easy to continue the fight in this state. When the 11th round opened, I rushed forward, showing a freshness that I didn't really possess. Red immediately understood this trick, as old as time. He entered the clinch to save himself. Once free, he allowed me to take a position, which was part of his strategy. Red feinted with his left, tricked me into dodging, and delivered an uppercut with his right, knocking me to the floor again. After that, he no longer gave me rest, continuing to strike, despite the fact that he himself was tired. Red fought with intensity and purpose. He pressed me to the ropes, clung to me in clinches, threw punches, and didn't let me put my hands down. The hall roared because it was his hall. Almost every voice shouted, "Finish him, Red! Come on, Red! He's yours, Red!" It was supposed to be a spectacular finish that the audience came to the fight for, and Red, who had been saving his strength for half an hour, now gave his all. This was his last chance, now or never. His strength was draining rapidly, and Red's hope was that before he was completely exhausted, he would have time to finish the battle in his favor. But he soon realized that I was too young and full of energy to give up so easily. I still had some stamina left. I held on, barely. I stumbled and staggered, and Red's legs were cramping. However, he gritted his teeth and continued to throw blows, each of which required great effort. And although I did almost no damage to him, Red grew weaker, just like me. His blows, although they reached their target, lost strength, and each of them required incredible effort from him. His legs felt like lead, they dragged behind him. Noticing this, my team shouted words of encouragement at me from the stands. Red gathered his remaining strength and delivered 2 blows, a left one just above the solar plexus and a right cross to the jaw. These were light blows, but I was so exhausted and stunned that I fell. The judge stood over me, loudly counting down the seconds. If I don't get up by 10, the fight is over for me. The hall froze in silence. Red stood, swaying on weak legs, struggling to maintain his balance. Dizziness enveloped his consciousness, rows of faces of spectators swam and trembled before his eyes, and the distinct voice of the judge, counting to 10, sounded in my ears. But Red considered the fight his own. It was inconceivable to him that a person who had taken so many blows could get up. But I got up, and no one was more surprised by this than myself. On the count of 4, I rolled over onto my stomach and felt for the ropes. By 7, I pulled myself up to one knee, where I lingered, my head hanging limply on my shoulders. When the judge shouted 9, I stood up, taking the correct stance. My left hand covered my face, my right grabbed my stomach. So I protected my vulnerable points and moved towards Red, hoping for a clinch to buy time. As soon as I stood up, Red rushed at me, but both of his blows landed in the areas protected by my hands. The next moment, I grabbed him in the clinch, holding on desperately while the referee tried to separate us. Red himself helped the judge, hurrying to free himself. He knew how quickly young people recover, and he understood that I would be his if he did not have time to complete the battle. He only needed one decisive blow. I myself thought that the battle was lost. I thought Red had completely outplayed me. I slipped out of the clinch, teetering between defeat and survival. One precise blow could decide everything. Red tried to throw this punch, but it was neither strong nor fast enough. I staggered, but didn't fall. I retreated to the ropes and grabbed them. Red followed me and hit me again, but his energy was gone. All he had left was his knowledge of boxing, but due to fatigue it no longer mattered. The blow intended for my jaw hit my shoulder. Red wanted to raise the blow higher, but his exhausted muscles did not obey. Having struck, he staggered and almost fell. Red tried again. This time his punch missed completely, and from sheer exhaustion, he collapsed on top of me, clinching to keep himself from falling to the floor. His strength was completely exhausted. All he could do was hang on to me to save himself from falling. Even in the clinch, he felt my superiority. When the judge separated us, he saw me slowly coming to my senses. My strength still remained with me. My shots, although not too strong at the beginning, were quite accurate and began to produce results. Red's eyes saw my gloved fist moving towards his jaw, and he wanted to protect it with his hand. He saw the danger and wanted to react, but his hand seemed to become heavy and motionless. He tried to lift her with all his strength, but nothing worked. My blow reached its target. Red felt a sharp jolt, and the next moment his consciousness seemed to plunge into darkness. When Red came to his senses, he was already in his corner. The crowd around was screaming. One of his comrades pressed a wet sponge to the base of his skull. Another splashed cold water on his face and chest. His gloves were off. At that moment, I stepped to the center of the ring to accept my victory. Red watched all of this while his team dealt with it. Later, he admitted to me that at that moment, he remembered how I was on the verge of defeat. He refused help when his team tried to take him through the ropes. Instead, he climbed over them himself, stepped onto the floor, and, staggering a little, headed towards the exit along with his comrades. Someone in the crowd shouted after him, "Why didn't you finish him off?" "Fuck you," Red said, and continued on his way to the Q-wing hole. I remained sitting in my chair until the arena was empty and the security captain approached me. "Come with me," he said. I followed him. We left the arena, but did not head towards the Q-wing building. We walked to a trailer parked behind the barn. The captain opened the trailer door with a key, swung it open, and said, "I'll come back for you tomorrow around noon." He motioned for me to come in and then closed and locked the door behind me. The trailer was old, I guessed from the late 1940s. The floor was covered with linoleum. The walls were decorated with thin wooden panels. At the far end, there was a bedroom. In the middle, there was a small bathroom and a closet opposite it. And closer to the entrance, there was a kitchenette and a combined dining room with a living room. A woman was sitting on the sofa smoking a cigarette. I've never seen her before. On the sofa, opposite me, sat a beautiful adult woman who looked to be about 40 years old. "You're not Red," she said. "I'm waiting for Red." "He won't come," I answered. Were you the one who fought with him today? To him. I guess you win. Red fell before me. The woman Rede. It seems you chose the wrong place to meet him. I'm the grand prize. The winner gets the woman to spend the night with, and Red always wants me. I didn't answer, assuming that she would do whatever she wanted anyway, not caring about my opinion. If it would be beneficial for her to sleep with me, she would do it and make the most of it. I saw a bottle standing on the kitchen table. She noticed how I was looking at her. The whiskey is yours too. Are you unhappy with me? Red was close to winning. No one asked what I would want if I won, but I have no problem with you or whiskey. My name is Sandy. Oh yes, they left some clothes for you. I put them in the bedroom. What's your name? Marlene Kane. Killer Kane. Some people call me that. Are there any other prizes I should know about? I was told to fry you a steak. How do you want it? Weak. With a pink middle. Yes. I went into the bedroom and took off my swimming trunks. They were cheap swimwear. Then I went into the bathroom. The trailer was old, the shower was small and basic, but the water was hot. There was a thick towel on the toilet lid. When I returned to the kitchen, Sandy had already set the table. I was surprised to see real knives and forks. She was wearing a men's denim shirt that barely covered her butt. She was tall and curvy, with a head of natural curly brown hair. Her eyes were almond-shaped, her nose was small and upturned, with a barely noticeable fluff on her upper lip. She had wide, sensual pink lips, and her smile revealed even white teeth. I sat down at the small table between the kitchen and living room. Sandy sat across from me while I started eating my steak. How do you like it? She asked. Less than necessary, I replied. The steak was a pound, New York sirloin. She almost got it right, but it wasn't enough. You're not much of a talker, she said. I just spent the evening getting beaten up and I'm tired. She fell silent and only asked if she could have some whiskey. Take it, I replied. After eating, I went to the bedroom and lay down on the bed. Sandy spent a long time fiddling around in front, and I fell asleep. Later, I woke up in the dark, feeling a hot body nearby. The room was stuffy, and the smell of alcohol entered my nose, making me cough. I realized that there was someone next to me, and this person seemed to be intoxicated. This stranger muttered something incomprehensible, and then lay down on me, clearly needing support so as not to fall out of bed. I felt its weight and relaxed, deciding not to resist. The body seemed to require rest, and soon I heard light snoring. I had to carefully move her so that she could lie quietly and not fall. Her eyes were closed and her breathing was even. It was obvious that she had completely passed out, immersed in sleep. I laid her gently on the bed and covered her with a blanket, hoping that the morning would bring her relief from what seemed to be a rough night. I lay back down, trying not to disturb her, and soon fell asleep again. The next morning, I quickly took a shower. As the water flowed down my body, I replayed everything that had happened during the night in my head and became aroused. I got dressed and was surprised to see Sandy in the kitchen. She was in her shirt, sitting at the table with a cup of black coffee. She looked terrible. She only muttered in response when I wished her good morning. She complained of a hangover. I poured myself some coffee and sat down. She looked pathetic. I need a shower, she said. Go and take it, I replied. And then what? She asked. And then whatever, I said. I don't remember anything from last night. I wish I had a bath, she said as she stepped out of the shower. She didn't stay there long. I was on the bed when she came out, drying herself, and sat down on the edge. I could use something to drink, she said. The whiskey bottle was empty. We had sex again, but after that I never saw Sandy again. Red didn't say anything about me getting his woman, and I didn't bring it up either. After Sandy, I slept with an inmate from Lowell Women's Prison. Her name was Nell. Nell was about my age, about 5 meters tall, weighed no more than 45 kilograms, with long blonde hair. She was jailed for illegal substances. A hippie girl who liked both boys and girls. She herself volunteered to be my prize for money or something else. She had a girlfriend in Lowell, and she may have proposed to Nell. She was waiting for me in the trailer after the fight. I showered and went through my usual rituals before joining her on the bed. We looked at each other and smiled. We met a few more times before she was replaced by another girl as a sporting prize. I was king of the hill for a few years until someone bigger came along, and I left while I had the chance. After that, I was made the chief gladiator of the Q Wing. I dealt with the problems of newcomers and violent prisoners for security. I handled issues that others didn't have the time or inclination to address. Jeff was an elderly toilet cleaner who had been in prison for 18 years for 2 cases of negligent homicide. He has already served 10 years. His behavior and manner of communication were terrible. He was rude to the guards, refused to wash himself, and his cell resembled a dump, so he was made a permanent toilet cleaner. One day, he was cleaning the showers and reached the 3rd stall, where he discovered that someone had stained the white tiles. Seeing this, he winced and went to the guard. Most of the guards didn't like Jeff because of his rudeness. He stated that he was not going to remove it. The security guard reported this to the shift sergeant. The sergeant said, "Put it away." After 10 minutes, Jeff was cleaning up with profanity. Nobody loved him, but everyone understood him. Later that day, he stated, "Whoever did this, you sneaky, dirty bastard. If I catch you, I'll break your face in." There was silence in the restroom. Everyone looked at Jeff. He entered his cell, slammed the door, and never showed up again. A few days later, it happened again, but this time not as bad. There are only about a dozen small spots per square foot of wall. Removing this was a piece of cake. But Jeff took it differently. He got mad. He went straight to the sergeant and said, "Listen, you fat bastard, I know you'll set me up, so fuck you. One of your scumbags has dirtied my shower again." The sergeant stood up and pressed the panic button on his radio. "I'm not going to listen to your threats this time," he said. Jeff shouted, "The rat who told you that is probably the one doing it." A few seconds later, 5 guards came running, handcuffed Jeff, and sent him to the punishment cell for making threats. After 18 days, Jeff returned. Everything to the same place. 13 days later, Jeff was sitting in the lounge playing Pinocho. Someone noticed Scott hurriedly walking towards the bathroom wearing only shorts. Jeff followed him. Scott entered the booth and closed the door. He had no idea that Jeff was following him. While Scott was rinsing off with toilet water, Jeff was waiting for him. Scott could be heard splashing and washing off the water. As soon as Scott opened the stall door, Jeff rushed inside. Scott was no match for him. Everyone in the break room is delighted. Someone says to Jeff, "What the hell did you do to him?" Jeff casually replies, "I did as I promised." The guard returns to the capsule. He sees Scott on the floor and immediately presses the panic button. The entire capsule is blocked. Medicine cones. Scott leaves on a stretcher. Everyone is looking out their window. The guards, sergeant, and advisors are everywhere. They all gather together. The 6 of them then go straight to Jeff's cell. They handcuff him and take him to the pit. Reason: attack. There was a lot of worry and trouble for small results, and others had to clean the toilets and showers while Jeff was in the hole. Back in 1992, a new prisoner with the nickname Cat Piss arrived at the prison. On his first day at Ryford, he took the wrong seat. This was his first conflict with Matt, one of the longtime prisoners. Matt warned him not to sit in that seat again, but Cat Piece ignored the request. The situation became tense, and constant clashes began between them. In prison, it is important to respect each other and understand that every action can lead to serious consequences. Another incident occurred with Jason, who was playing handball in the prison court. He loved to tease his opponents, and this often led to tense moments. One day, a newcomer named Zach did not appreciate his sharp words and challenged Jason to a tough fight. Tension grew between them, and eventually it ended in a fight. In a prison environment, it is important to keep your mouth shut and respect others, because words can easily escalate into conflict. There was also the case of Shane, a young prisoner who loved to pull pranks that not everyone liked. Shane was known for his nasty antics that sometimes crossed the line. One day in the cafeteria, he tried to play a joke on the old prisoner Donnie, which caused great discontent. Donnie didn't appreciate Shane's joke and made it clear that prison has its own rules of behavior that should be followed. Donnie was serious and determined to defend his right to respect, which he demonstrated later. These stories show how important respect is in environments where tension is always high. In prison, every little thing can lead to conflict, so it is important to be able to control your actions and words to avoid unnecessary problems. This is not only a lesson for those who are incarcerated, but also a reminder to everyone of the importance of respect for others and the consequences that can occur when that respect is violated. Behavior problems are not the only challenge. Politics began to escalate when new prisoners arrived with special requirements. From the very beginning, they showed special sensitivity to the conditions of their stay. Everyone else was used to what was there, but some groups required special treatment. "Eating pork is against our beliefs," said one of the new prisoners. "We cannot eat it or even touch it, and it should not be prepared where our food is prepared." These demands began to change the daily life of the prison. The food in prison had never been of high quality, but with the advent of new rules, everything became more difficult. Requirements for the exclusion of pork and the preparation of special dishes became a constant subject of discussion. As a result, pork was removed from the menu, and they switched to dishes that suited the needs of a certain group, but were not popular with everyone else. One of the prisoners expressed the opinion that changes in diet create problems for everyone else. Prisoners now had to fill out special forms to receive a special menu. Those who did not fill out the form received a limited set of dishes. These changes caused dissatisfaction, but the prison administration insisted on compliance with the new rules. One day, a new prisoner named Donate arrived in prison. He was known for his troubles with the law and a long history of crime. However, thanks to legal subtleties, he managed to avoid punishment and was released. This caused dissatisfaction among many who felt that the system was too lenient. A few years later, I found myself in a difficult situation when my health deteriorated sharply. I was sent to the prison medical center, where they examined me and discovered a serious illness. After that, I was released. They gave me some money and a bus ticket to Salt Springs. The trip lasted 8 hours with a stop for lunch. There were all sorts of people gathered on the bus, and among them I felt lost. When we arrived in the city, I hardly recognized him after all these years. But I was free, and that was the main thing. Since I didn't take anything with me from prison, my first visit was to an army store near the bus station. The store was filled with military equipment of all kinds. I needed clothes and shoes, but finding my size was difficult, so I just bought a hiking backpack and left. The semi-dormitory where I wanted to stay was located 2 miles from the city center, near the local college campus in an old motel. I gave the clerk the directions and voucher, filled out the paperwork, and received the room key. The clerk was a plump Latino, probably mixed race. There was a gold wedding ring on her finger. She handed me a business card. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, at the very end of the corridor, next to the convenience store," she said. The air conditioner didn't work, but the room was clean enough. I opened one of the windows. The water was hot. The Filipina maid brought me bed linen and towels. "If you need anything, let me know," she suggested. Her name tag said Feliciata. I had to take care of my own nutrition. I bought a sandwich, a bottle of chocolate milk, a toothbrush and toothpaste, and a couple of lottery tickets from the store. There was no TV in the room, so I ate, took a shower, went to bed and thought, tomorrow we'll start from scratch. At 65, I was bald and looked like Mr. Proper. In prison, I tried to keep myself in shape and considered myself healthy until I got to the infirmary. But 65 is not 25. The first night in freedom, I slept normally. After 40 years in prison, falling asleep is not a problem. I woke up at 5 in the morning, as usual in prison, went to the toilet, brushed my teeth, and got dressed. Then I bought a sandwich and coffee at the store and went to find my parole officer to sort everything out. It took me a while to figure out the right bus, which took me almost to the parole service office. There I sat on a bench for an hour until a place opened up. My supervisor turned out to be a black girl named Malaysia Kempfert. I later found out that she was married to a white man named Kevin. She studied my documents before speaking. "Are you Marlene Kane?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied. She studied the papers again. "Why were you released? This doesn't make any sense. I have cancer. Is it true?" That's what they said. "How long do you have left?" They said it wouldn't be long. "And you are 65, and you are a lifer. You have neither a pension nor insurance. You're in a difficult situation. I don't see how I can help you. What did you do in prison?" "I tried to be useful," I replied. "What?" "I was loaded with work. All sorts of small and dirty tasks. It's clear. Have a family?" "I'm an orphan." Malaysia looked 22 or 23 years old. There was clearly a lot of white blood flowing in her veins. She could pass for a South Asian Indian or even one of the Kardashian sisters. There was a wedding ring on her finger. "I need $50 for your supervision," she said. "50 a month, right?" I handed her $50. "Come to me if you have anything in your pocket other than dust." The rest of our meeting was chatter. She gave me a card with the date of the next meeting, and I left. I went to the Come-Go store for coffee. There was a whole wall of machines that dispensed coffee, tea, soda, cappuccino, snow cones, frozen shakes, and soft-serve ice cream. A man and a woman with 4 children entered the store. The woman took a gallon of milk and bread, the man took a pack of beer, and the children noisily rushed to candy and vending machines. One of my lottery tickets was a winner a free ticket. This ticket won $500. The cashier gave me the money after the manager opened the safe. I bought a few more tickets and went to look for a bank to open an account and get a card. Then I went to get my phone, clothes, and other necessary things. Returning to the half house, I checked the remaining tickets. Damn, another win. I returned to the store with the ticket, but the cashier didn't have that much money. She gave me the address and phone number of the lottery office. In short, the process of obtaining money was complicated, filled with bureaucracy, but in the end, everything was resolved. After some time, $600,000 after taxes and other things were transferred to my new bank account. I returned to the motel. Feliciata appeared in my room almost immediately. It was late evening, almost 5 o'clock. We were just talking, and the atmosphere was calm. She told me about her life, how she moved to America, and how her fate turned out. Feliciata explained that she married Frank, a former Army sergeant, and how their life was initially happy until Frank fell into bad company. Since then, their financial situation has deteriorated, and Felicity finds herself in a difficult situation. She had to look for work to provide for herself and her child. She said she worked at a motel as a maid for a while and tried her best to make ends meet. But life in the trailer park was hard. Frank left and Felicity was forced to continue caring for herself and her child alone. Her mother Mayumi helped as best she could, but there was still not enough money. Feliciata invited me to live in a trailer with her, pay her bills, and help her. She was ready to offer me her hospitality and support. I agreed, and our life together became more stable. Soon Mayumi also moved in with us, and we tried to cope with difficulties together. Life in the trailer park was not easy, but we found moments of joy and understanding. We were a small family. We tried to support each other and moved forward, despite all the difficulties. Felicity was a very open person and trusted me. She talked about her past and how she had to cope with difficulties. Despite all the difficulties she experienced, she maintained her fortitude and believed that she could provide a better life for herself and her child. Our days were filled with ordinary activities and worries. Together, we arranged our little trailer, made it cozy and comfortable. We tried to forget about the hard times and lived in the present, creating new pleasant memories. But one day tragedy overtook us. Feliciata and her father were killed. This event shocked all of us, and especially Mayumi. We tried to support her and cope with the loss together. The city was angry and local authorities were trying to get to the bottom of the situation. Malaysia, our mutual friend, wanted to take revenge for Feliciata, but I did not support this idea. Instead, we tried to move on with our lives and keep Feliciate's memory alive. Life was full of difficulties, but we did our best to cope with them and support each other. Despite all the trials, we believed that we could find a way to a better life and preserve the memories of those we had lost. Sitting on the porch of the trailer, I thought about my life. It would seem that so much has passed, from hungry days in a foster family to serving in Vietnam, from the dusty roads of youth, where you had to get by in order to somehow feed yourself, to decades spent behind bars. My life was like one of those old, faded posters you see in roadhouses, showing a dusty road with no signposts ahead. It's easy to get lost in such places. It's easy to lose yourself if you don't know what you're looking for. I have always been drawn to fighting, whether it be real fist fights or living a life of survival in prison. I'm used to being in the thick of things, where every moment is a challenge, where every action determines what the next day will be like. There were moments when I thought that this was true freedom, the opportunity to fight, to win, to live with one goal to prove that you are worth something. But here I sit here on the threshold of the trailer, and suddenly I understand that true freedom is not just survival. It's about being able to choose how you want to live each day. Now, years later, I feel tired of the struggle. But not the physical fatigue that comes after a long day of work, but the one that accumulates inside fatigue from constant tension, waiting for the next blow. I found something in this trailer park that I had never known before. There were no loud fights here, there was no need to prove one's strength, but there was Felicia, her kindness and understanding. She made me feel truly needed, and not just a tool for solving other people's problems. My meeting with Felicity was a turning point in my life. Her gentle gaze and calm, warm smile penetrated my long-built defense. She didn't try to change me, didn't judge me for the past, didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Feliciata simply accepted me as I am with all my scars, mistakes, and fatigue, which I hardly noticed anymore, but which was always with me. Her serene presence was like a breath of fresh air that I so desperately sought but could not find. Her smile became my salvation, a reminder that even in the darkest life, you can find light if you allow yourself to see it. We built this small house together, and every day spent with her was a discovery for me. I found my place not only in space, but also in a world that seemed ruthless and cold to me. Together we dreamed, laughed, and planned for the future. Her laughter ringing and lively echoed through the empty rooms and filled them with warmth, making me believe that maybe I deserve happiness. Feliciata was not just a woman who happened to be there at the right time. She became the meaning of my existence, a source of light in the darkness. When tragedy struck, it hit me deeper than I could have expected. The deaths of Felicia and her father were unfair, cruel, and destructive, like so many things in this world. I felt an emptiness growing inside me, which was so huge that it seemed as if it was swallowing everything around me. I could not cope with this anger, this all-consuming pain that was slowly but surely eating me from the inside. At times I wanted to go back to the old ways of solving problems, find those who did it, and take revenge to give vent to this furious fire bubbling inside. But deep down I knew that this would not bring peace to either me or Mayumi. Revenge is never the solution. It is just a short moment of satisfaction followed by more emptiness. We just tried to move on as best we could. It wasn't easy. It was like walking on quicksand. Every step was difficult. Every day seemed endless. We tried to preserve the memory of facilitate in every warm word, in every gentle gesture that we shared with each other. We talked about her when the evening brought melancholy. We remembered her smile and her care. Mayumi often brought flowers to her photo, placed them in a small vase, and each time her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide. We learned to live with pain, not to let it consume us completely. Now I understand that life is not just a series of events and mistakes, but also the lessons that we learn from them. I thought that my destiny was to be a fighter, a person who always goes ahead, gritting his teeth. But now that the pain has subsided a little, it seems to me that my task is to be a person who can take care of others, who can be there when needed. Feliciata taught me this. She showed that strength is not only the ability to defend oneself, but also the ability to love, support, and be a support. It may not be heroism in the traditional sense, but it's something I can do. This is my way of honoring the memories of those I have loved and lost, and I hope it will not be in vain. The sun slowly dropped below the horizon, filling the sky with shades of orange and pink, and I breathed in the evening air, full of the smells of grass and dust. The silence of nature that filled me reminded me that life, despite all the blows, goes on. My life may never be simple and calm. Perhaps the darkness will try to consume me again from time to time, but now I understand that this is not necessarily a bad thing. What matters is not how many blows you received, but how you dealt with them and what you did next. It is important that I did not give up, that I found the strength to continue, that I continue to look for the light every day, even when there is darkness around. And I'm ready to continue on my way, even if there are no signs ahead again. After all, in the end, this is real life, continuous movement forward, no matter what, and the ability to see beauty even in the most difficult moments. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.